as a lot of you know, I'm Palvi and I'm your host for today. My colleague and co-founder of Asian Pathfinders, Shreyas Deshmukh, he is the co-host. And thank you again for joining us on a Saturday morning. And so today we are doing a series, like two lectures this weekend and next weekend on the US presidential elections. We didn't want to just dedicate one because I think it's very important to understand what implications such elections have on the global geopolitics. So today we have Dr. Harsh Pant, and next week we are going to have Ambassador Meera Shankar. Uh, Shreyas will share the link for registration in the chat a little later, but keep an eye out also on our social media pages. So before we go ahead, I'll just give a brief about Asian Pathfinders for the ones who don't know. So we are a knowledge sharing platform. We hold weekly discussions on Saturdays at 11, where we bring speakers from various walks of life to give their views and their expert insights on topics like this week's US presidential elections or something else like we've had on in the past. Uh, and I think the whole idea for us is to promote an interdisciplinary dialogue. And I'll just play this short explainer series that we've put up for everyone. You can always check our YouTube. But this one is on the US presidential election. So I'll just give you guys a brief. Sorry for the music, it's just for this YouTube and everything. But yeah, and definitely we welcome feedback. We're going to do these series every week on a specific theme. So like I said, for next week, we have Ambassador Meera Shankar. For the ones who don't know, she was India's ambassador to US in from 2009 to 2011. Prior to that, she served as the ambassador for Germany, and she's also going to speak on the US presidential elections. Post that, we have historian Rana Safi. And after that, we have former IPS officer who was DG of UP Police, Sutapta Sanyal, joining us. So we have three amazing women uh, joining us to give their views. And just to give you a brief about the community guidelines, we do encourage everyone to express their views. We want to promote that kind of a discussion, but please respect each other's views. Respect intellectual property. If you want to use any of the material, if you want to reference it, please reach out to the speakers, and obviously never post any defamatory or illegal content. So these is just our handles, and if you want to reach out to us, you can write to us or look us up on social media. So I am going to just get out of the screen and see if Harsh has joined us. Uh, so I am not sure. I'm
He's
okay. Sorry, Harsh. I did. I can't see it. So I would just give you a brief. I know a lot of you know Professor Harsh Pant, but if you don't, then I think you've not really studied strategic studies. Uh, Personally, I think I reached out to Harsh when he was at King's College 10 years ago when I was doing my master's dissertation, and he was a great person to interview and give me insights on global geopolitics. A rookie master's student, he was very kind to me, but currently he's the professor of IR at King's College. He's also director of studies and head of strategic studies program at ORF. He's also the non-resident fellow with the Wadhwani chair in the US India Policy Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, DC. He's a visiting professor at IIM Bangalore. He's a visiting fellow at the Center for the Advanced Studies of India, University of Pennsylvania. visiting scholar at the Center for International Peace and Security Studies, McGill University. And his recent books and list of publications is long, but just put a few for your reference. And I'll not take much time. I will pass it on to you, Harsh. So over to you.
Thank you, Pallavi, and thank you everyone for having me as part of this conversation. Your lineup is very interesting, so it's a formidable lineup after me. So I'm pretty, a bit overwhelmed to be coming before those wonderful ladies. But I'll try my best. I think all of us are, in our own ways, trying to work out what is happening in the US and what impact it will have. Mr. Trump is very difficult to analyze. So in a sense, analysis of what he's doing is the I would think the most formidable job today if you're trying to understand what is behind his politics, his policies, the way he negotiates certain issues. But I think what the consensus, it seems, even those of us who are present today, would be that US matters. You can be anywhere in the world, but US elections matter not only for the fact that here is a big democracy trying to manage its internal contradictions in ways that perhaps few others do. India does it in a similar manner. But I think, given the imprint, given the impact, given the, critical centrality that US has in global order, you can be in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in any part of Asia, in India, that impact would be felt, that the change in Washington, D.C. administration would have an impact on how your peripheries would be impacted, your trade policies, strategic policies, technology evolution, foreign policy. All of these policies would be impacted whatever happens in Washington, even if you have a similar individual transitioning into a different administration. That individual carries in the second administration a different set of priorities, and those change, those evolve, and we have seen that happening in the last few administrations, where Obama in first term versus Obama in second term, George W. Bush in first term versus George W. Bush in second term. So I think therefore elections in America matter. Elections in America, love to engage as students of international relations. We love to engage with what is happening in that space, and we are even with Mr. Trump. Of course, he's very entertaining television. But even with that, the idea that the policies that he's going to bring will have a significant impact on our lives, on day-to-day lives. Whether it is H-1B visa, whether it is trade, whether it's technology. I mean, that is the whole conversation we were having before 2016. Although at that point in time, no one really thought that Mr. Trump would emerge as the winning candidate, but he did, and he surprised everyone. And then I think a lot of the last 4 years, the world has been grappling with that surprise, what to make of it, what potentially can be done about it, and how do you navigate that terrain. But what is interesting is that US foreign policy is so integral to the way, as I was saying, is so critical to the evolution of the global order, to individual nation states' foreign policies. But elections in US are never fought on foreign policy matters, or rarely fought on foreign policy matters. You'll have to go historically way back and think when was the last time foreign policy played such an important role. In fact, never you would find that foreign policy was the issue which sort of shifted the terrain. Even at the time, for example, in recent years, when George W. Bush were having a difficult time with his two wars, Obama's entry into the field was not so much that he was an anti-war candidate. Yes, part of that was his allure, but I think the larger issue was how he brought in a different sensibility to government and to domestic political issues. And he was not so much of a foreign policy senator in any case. If you recall, Obama's foreign policy record was very patchy before he became president. So in a sense, foreign policy issues do not tend to determine generally American elections. and they also are not, they are also not the key factors in the way the two candidates discuss their platforms. For a small group of foreign policy watchers, for external interlocutors, it's very interesting to read every single line, to say, to watch every single statement and to make a big hue and cry about it. But partly, for the domestic audience, that doesn't really matter. If you look at the domestic coverage of American elections in American media, you would see that hardly they are not covering international, space, what is happening in the larger, global space, if you will. They're more focused on small counties, small, battleground states, which voting bloc is moving which way. So clearly, America is a rather self-consumed society in that sense, for good reasons, and they are, the impact that these elections have on the world perhaps is also lost on the American, election system, not on the candidates, but on the election system. So there are two contradictory points here. One is that American foreign policy, American elections have this great impact on the way world and global geopolitics evolves. On the other hand, domestic politics, domestic media space, domestic contestation is hardly ever around, in elections, hardly ever around a foreign policy. Now, so I have been, Pallavi and Shreyas and others have asked me to talk about foreign, US elections and global geopolitics. So I'll just give you a brief overview of where I think and how I think one can think about some of these issues, and perhaps then leave it open for discussions and your questions, comments, and observations. Now, if you go back to Second World War and you see this end of the Second World War, since then we have lived with almost Pax Americana. We have lived with this idea that America is the critical anchor in the global order. We call it Western liberal order, but West is largely, when we say West, it's largely America. It's largely its policies, its inclinations, its leadership that has determined the trajectory of this global order. So what happened after the end of the Cold War? Again, I'm assuming most of you are IR students, IR, enthusiasts. At the end of the Cold War saw a very interesting argument being played out in the US, explicated most categorically by Francis Fukuyama, that this is the end of history. That if history were a contestation of ideas, then at the level of ideas, free market capitalism and liberal democracy has won the day. So there is nothing else to compete with. The West had won, America had won, and that it would mean that in policy terms you would see that explosion of liberal capitalism, free market capitalism, and liberal democracy across the world. It would sweep the world, and everyone would be democratic. Everyone would pursue free market capitalism, and everyone would live happily thereafter. So there was an argument around that Fukuyama's end of history claim made. And this was the high point of optimism in global order. George H.W. Bush, the first president who oversaw this transition, he was talking about a new world order, because he looked at, his point of emphasis was the Iraq War, the first Gulf War, and how there was a seeming consensus among major powers to take action against Iraq, what Iraq was doing, what Saddam was doing to Kuwait. And so from that, it was extrapolated that perhaps from now on, we would see less of great power competition, and therefore free market capitalism and liberal democracy would be the guarantors of that new order. Now, we all know, how that panned out, how that, the consequences are for all of us to see. But I think what it gives you, and from there, if you move to the first fully formed administration in post-Cold War phase, which was the Clinton administration. The ideas that drove Clinton administration in global politics were ideas of liberal internationalism. Again, being driven from a lot of what Fukuyama was saying, that spreading democracy around the world is a good thing. That free market capitalism, that a certain version of capitalism is good, is a public good which needs to be exported, and America's role as a supporter of that value system, political and economic, is going to be the hallmark of this new global order. And I think that is something that has again stood the test of time. America was always, American policymakers had always talked of democracy promotion and how America is this great exemplar of democracy and everyone should emulate it. But post Cold War, it got, there was a visible sense of optimism and a visible thrust vis-a-vis this policy, which I think is, again, very interesting if you think about the consequences that came later. But at that point in time, when you look at the Clinton administration's arguments, Clinton administration was looking at the world through this prism of liberal internationalism. And the kind of debates that you saw, I think, exemplify that. I mean, you had two groups, the contestation within Clinton administration, which eventually got resolved in favor of liberal internationalists, fundamentally resolved around China question. And again, it is interesting how China continues to be the single most important variable in American foreign policy for a long time, especially since the end of the Cold War, because China presented a unique opportunity and a challenge. So for Clinton administration and many who were part of this administration who believed in liberal internationalism, China was an opportunity to showcase to the world the power of liberal internationalism. So you had a country like China, a communist country with a communist party heading it, and yet China was absorbing elements of free market capitalism. China was veering in a direction, and that gave them ideas that, look, here is China. Even a country like China is adopting free market capitalism, and eventually China would become a democracy. They have already adopted free market capitalism. Eventually, democracy would come. Middle classes would rise against China because they would want greater freedom, and they would liberate China from the clutches of Communist Party. Now, the assumption there was that democracy, as practiced in the West, is a valued public good across the world and across cultures, and that the trajectory, the linearity of the process, that you have free market forces, and then they lead to political openness, was a linearity that was accepted as something that again would move from one part of the world, can be transmuted from one part of the world to another. So this very powerful argument. In theory, it's a very powerful argument, but the idea was to operationalize this into practice in China. And so this idea emerged in terms of policy for Clinton administration, that integration of China into the global order is something that they need to pursue. Therefore, entry of China in World Trade Organization, it was Clinton administration that pushed it. That China, instead of being contained, instead of being marginalized, instead of being isolated, would need to be brought into the liberal market, liberal democracy, free market framework. And what better way to do it than integrate into international institutions? What better way than integrate into global frameworks, which would allow China a greater say in what is happening in global politics. So, this is a very, interesting argument, which even today we are grappling with, what to do with China. And that was resolved under Clinton administration by arguing that liberal internationalism is the way to go, that we will integrate China into the global framework, and that way China will become more like us eventually. This is the best way to manage the China question. Again, China question never went away. Since Cold War, we have seen different versions of it. It started off under Clinton administration, it's a consensus within Clinton administration on what to do with China by integrating it into the global order, greater integration into the global order. And by the time Clinton administration left office, it was very clear that China and that integration has helped China. Now, what was not clear was that integration had helped the West, but it was clear that integration into the global market, greater integration, has made it possible for China to get the kind of benefits that a free market country gets as part of it being in WTO, as part of it being part of other organizations. But China, the reciprocity from China was not there, because China could still hide behind the fact that it would take time. It's still a developing country, and it would therefore manage its evolution in ways that will be more gradual. And so this fundamental contradiction remained at the heart of American foreign policy framework ever since Clinton administration defined it in one particular way. So the result was that when Clinton administration was succeeded by George W. Bush administration, the Republicans had a better understanding of this question in terms of geopolitics. And so if you recall, I'm sure some of you would have been very young, but even those who are doing some research or would have seen, there was a very, when George W. Bush started making his pitch for presidency, his advisor on foreign policy was Condoleezza Rice, who later became Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, professor at Stanford now. She wrote this interesting article, which is especially important if you are studying Indian foreign policy and how Indo-US relations changed. She wrote this article where she made this, from Indian perspective, very big claim that India should not be looked at from the India-Pakistan prism. That America should start looking India through the prism of regional balance of power. And why this argument was being propounded? Because there was a sense in certain Republican constituencies that China is challenging America already then in the Asian landscape. And if you have to manage China's rise, then traditional alliances like Australia and Japan are not going to be enough. You will need new partners. And India, therefore, is very important, is very critical, is going to be the anchor in that sense in how this geopolitics in Asia, in geopolitics in Asia Pacific emerges. And therefore, the argument that Condoleezza Rice made in that very famous article is that stop looking at India from India-Pakistan prism. India is actually the larger variable in the emerging balance of power. And if we want to balance China, if we want to manage China, then India needs to be looked at more holistically as part of the larger regional landscape. So remember, today, this is almost common wisdom that Indo-Pacific and how Indian and Pacific Oceans are together and how India is part of this larger global balance of power. But when George W. Bush was contesting elections in 2000, this was not the conventional wisdom. India was still simply part of South Asia. South Asia was disconnected from Asia Pacific, as if these are two different geographies which were being managed by American bureaucracy, both military and State Department, very, very differently. So you see a shift starts happening under George W. Bush, where the geopolitics of the region starts shifting from the Euro-Atlantic to the Asia Pacific. The shift is not complete, but starts happening. What puts a brake on this is 9/11. So you have the September 11 attacks, and suddenly the focus of American foreign policy shifts to the Middle East and Afghanistan. But underlying thrust remains. I mean, George, there is a lot of, there has been a big debate around George W. Bush administration and what they did with war on terror, etc., etc. But in some ways, that administration laid the foundations of an emerging Asia Pacific, Indo-Pacific, which we call today, strategy, which has been taken forward by successive administrations. So despite the fact that a lot of concentration was on Iraq, was on Afghanistan, those big decisions under George W. Bush administration, the civil nuclear deal with India, what was it about? It was about changing the balance of power in the region. It was about putting aside the one big constraint in Indo-US engagement, which was a non-proliferation question, removing that overhang from the relationship so that the relationship can become more normal. India can be given greater access to global markets. And India can become a more normal player in the larger global hierarchy. And so, that civil nuclear deal, those who mattered both in America and in India saw it as a balance of power equation more than a non-proliferation equation, because it has had profound consequences for Indo-US relations. If you are studying Indo-US relations today and you're looking at the expanse of the engagement, if you look at just the defense engagement, for example, it would not have been possible without that Rubicon being crossed. So in a sense, when you are looking at the trajectory of you have to look at George W. Bush administration as a very, very important one, but it was also important in many other ways. George W. Bush administration also reached out, for example, to Vietnam, a country that, again, interesting relations with America, historically antagonistic. But today, if you look at America-Vietnam relations, they are almost as if no Vietnam War ever took place. Vietnamese are today much more aligned with American strategic priorities in the region than they have ever been. So clearly, the basis for this was laid under George W. Bush administration. So George W. Bush administration, for all its focus on the Middle East, was also laying the foundation of an emerging Indo-Pacific strategy, as we call it today. And so by the time you had an Obama administration came to office berating a lot of foreign policy decisions of the predecessor of George W. Bush administration. But Obama administration clearly knew that the campaign that on which Obama fought, a large part of that was that he would undo a lot of what Mr. George W. Bush did, but he would not fight wars again the way George W. Bush administration was fighting, that he would roll back these wars both in Afghanistan and Iraq, and by the time his in the first term, this was the focus of his intent. But if you go back to the initial stages of Obama administration, there was this big debate that happened within Obama administration as to what to do with China, like every administration does. Again, a central feature of American foreign policy making. And there, a lot of very close advisors to Obama talked of a G2, global condominium of America and China, who together can run the world. So there was a very realistic appraisal of where America stood, and their argument was that let's make it a case that as two major powers working together, and China can manage the Pacific, America can manage the Atlantic, and let's focus on this. Now, that again was an attempt to look at how far China has risen and how difficult it was becoming to manage China. Now, thankfully, I think for us and for many other countries in the region, this was given a decent burial. It did not really go much beyond a certain ecosystem. But the idea that America and China can come together and work together for global order, just as at one point in time America and Soviet Union were working together as two big powers in the international order, has had a very profound impact on the thinking in the region. So a lot of countries in the region still talk about that G2. That even in India, for example, there are many bureaucrats. There are many in the establishment who look at this idea of China, America working together as a real possibility, and therefore the sense that can India trust America is a question that is often asked. Would it be possible for America to turn away from its engagements in the region is a question that often asked in the service of larger global engagement and larger global relationship with China. So, but that for Obama administration, that was a dead end. I think that the move was very, very quick from G2, and later on in the second half, you saw the movement towards defining what Obama wanted to do. And what was that critical phrase that they used? It was pivot to Asia Pacific, and then it was strategic rebalance to Asia Pacific, which was later turned to strategic rebalance. So pivot to Asia Pacific meant that American foreign policy was pivoting from Middle East to Asia. And the signal was that it is important for America to give a sense of credibility to its regional stakeholders about American intentions and about American desire to continue to play an important role in Asia Pacific. And later on, it turned to strategic rebalance. It was renamed as a strategic rebalance because pivot sounded a bit too tactical, that it was simply about that particular duration. But strategic rebalance, by definition, is strategic. So strategic rebalance means it's a long-term trend that in America would continue to do a lot, shift its force posture towards Asia Pacific. And the idea there was that America would eventually move most of its defense capabilities, defense posture towards Asia Pacific. Now, unfortunately for Obama, while the intent, he made his intent very clear, he could not do much in terms of operationalizing this intent. So therefore, you often hear this criticism, while yes, Obama talked a lot about Asia Pacific, Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State for Obama, talked a lot about it, but eventually nothing much happened on the ground. On the ground, China continued to hold sway. On the ground, Asia Pacific continued to be dominated by China's rise, and America was clearly missing in action. Now, when and this was one strand of engagement between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump when they were engaging with each other during the election campaign last time. That how much should America be doing in the world? Mr. Trump was very categorical that he does not want America to do much, that he wants America to retrench. He wants America to focus more on America first, therefore. Hillary Clinton, a traditional Democrat, was more or less more expansive in her orientation, but also less clear about how she would tackle China. Now, once you had Trump administration in office, what we have seen in the last 4 years is a dramatic recalibration of America's China policy. And whatever I think his other legacies might be, one of the most important legacies of Mr. Trump is going to be that he has managed to shift the discourse on China dramatically in a direction which is much more realistic about China's intent and capabilities in the region. And he has pushed not simply American bureaucracy to think that way, he has also pushed the discourse in Western Europe. Now, some of it has happened because China, of course, is playing a hand that is quite difficult to comprehend, making enemies around of every country, seemingly every country in the world. The way it handled coronavirus, the very aggressive and ambitious intent of Xi Jinping. But for Mr. Trump, from the very beginning, he started off by targeting China on trade and technology. And then it became a larger strategic posture. So if you read in America's defense strategy, it's very categorically lays out how China and Russia are going to be the long-term threats, and that great power competition is back, and that Indo-Pacific is going to be the center of gravity of global politics. So in some ways, free and open Indo-Pacific has been given greater acknowledgement. It has been defined much more categorically. It has been calibrated in ways that perhaps was not visible before. So there is a greater sync between ends, ways, and means, a classic strategy orientation in that sense. And the receptivity in the Indo-Pacific region is also a function of how this is changing. So in the Indo-Pacific engagement, what today you see that one of the biggest, I think, failures of China, which we often don't recognize, is that China, from the very beginning, has been against this very idea of Indo-Pacific. They have done everything possible to dismantle this construct. From the very beginning, China, even today, Chinese don't talk of an Indo-Pacific. But despite that, the buy-in that the Indo-Pacific construct, approach, idea, strategy, whatever you might want to call it, because different countries are calling it different ways in the region, whatever the uptake might be, it has been received across the region today, from Australia, New Zealand to Japan, South Korea to ASEAN, to India. There is a larger acknowledgement that Indo-Pacific strategic geography is a reality, that Indo-Pacific strategic geography is something that is a structural imperative. And therefore, for China, this is first major defeat in that sense, that they have not been able to push their agenda on this question. And I think the more aggressive they became, the more likely it has become that Indo-Pacific narrative has been accepted across the world. So in a sense, China's actions has pushed American foreign policy in a direction, but also American foreign policy has allowed the region as a whole to make it possible for that, for that consensus to emerge on certain tenets of the regional geopolitics. So it would be, I think, interesting going forward to see what happens with Mr. Biden, or if Mr. Trump is re-elected. But if you note the differences today, Mr. Biden himself is a classic Democrat, but is a traditional Democrat. But if you see his pronouncements on China, he's very, very cautious. He's almost taken the line that Trump has been advocating for a long time. So there has been a buy-in into that narrative on the Democrat side as well, and I don't think it's likely that a Biden victory would see Democrats going in a direction that that precedes Mr. Trump. So therefore, American elections have already, in some ways, shaped the geopolitics of the region, of global geopolitics, and in particular the geopolitics of Indo-Pacific, in a direction in the last few years, which has made it possible for us to conceptualize a new strategic geography, which has made it possible for us to think in terms of what are the consequences of China's rise more in operational terms. And I think this is going to be the trajectory going forward, given that Sino-American competition is likely to be the central narrative of global politics for some time at least. So I would end there and let Pallavi and Shreyas, whoever wants to take it forward. Yes.
Thank you so much, Harsh. I think you've summed it up, a lot of things that have happened over the last 30 years very well, and I think it very concisely. I have a question because I have the mic, but just related to there's a US president is actually called the leader of the free world. How do we see that shifting over, since, because when you said Francis Fukuyama said and that capitalism's won, and that was seen that US was the multipolar world it leading, but how has it shifted over the last 30 years? And how do you see, is US still going to be the leader of the free world, or are we going to see a more shift towards multilateralism, or what you spoke about G2? Are we going to see that kind of a world order?
Yeah, see, if one is talking of the leadership question in global politics, and this is, I think, an important one, because I don't, and leadership is important, and often, especially when there is strategic flux in the geopolitical environment, it matters how the world narrative, how world institutions, how world's operational postures are being led. And often the discussion that has emerged is that there is a large part of the world that feels that Mr. Trump especially has not led in a certain manner, although he has led in a different, one can argue that he may not be the best, perhaps, spokesman for American values. But in terms of the geopolitics, the way he has framed the debate is also a sign of leadership in his own way. But I think the challenge for America is, how do you reconcile, this idea that American leadership is embedded in the larger internationalist framework, which was something that that happened in the post-Second World War. The whole Bretton Woods system, the whole idea that these institutions will give legitimacy to American leadership. So American leadership has always been not a leadership whereby America leads on its own, but how that leadership gets embedded in a certain larger framework of values and institutions that are, of course, where American interests are protected and preserved, but also the interests of other actors. And I think the challenge, therefore, for America is whether America can, take that ownership of that kind of a role. Now, the challenge is that there is no one else to take that role. I mean, we know what is happening to European Union as a whole. We know what is, what is the situation with certain other actors. Now, I think, even during coronavirus, if you recall, go back to the early months, it was quite chaotic. No one knew who is in charge. Americans, Trump administration was bewildered. They were looking at everything from very, internal perspective. Everything was about America and Americans and how they should be they should get all the advantages. China, of course, was the problem, and China was not bothered about anyone else. So you saw that leadership vacuum in those initial days. And again, no institution could work. UN Security Council is yet to come out with a statement on coronavirus. G20 has not been able to make a statement on coronavirus. Forget any action. There's not been even a statement. So clearly, multilateralism also works when there is a clear leadership working and driving the agenda. So the challenge is that much as we think less of America today, there is no alternative in sight. And therefore, one argument that has been given is that perhaps a coalition of middle powers is something that needs to get more active. Countries like India, Australia, Japan, Vietnam, Singapore, South Korea, for example, did good job during the coronavirus crisis by handling their own neighbors. So perhaps that's the way to go, where fragmented leadership might emerge if America really does not take ownership of its leadership. Because in terms of capabilities, in terms of institutions, in terms of just the presence, I don't think we have an alternative to America. But if America itself is becoming consumed by internal issues, which I don't think are going away, even if Mr. Trump were not to be the president of America, I think the internal debates with America are becoming more and more inward looking. So in that sense, even Mr. Biden, for example, would be loath to expand American presence everywhere. So I think either America finds a different way of projecting power and of leading the world, and bring its domestic commitments with its international obligations into some kind of a balance, or the rest of the world looks at alternatives where like-minded countries converge. I'm sure democracies of the world can't really expect China to be part of that same framework. We are already talking about how democracies can get together and lead on emerging strategic technologies. The idea that London has proposed, Johnson administration has proposed that democracy should come together and develop 5G technology, for example. So clearly we are looking at fragmentation of global leadership, and that is already happening. Because you are already seeing the rise of China changing the dynamic, that there always be some countries who would find that China is a better model, that China needs to be followed. And I think that contestation might lead to this fragmentation, and we may not see the kind of unipolar moment that we saw in post-1990s world. But I think a lot would depend on how Americans themselves define their global role. And again, we will have to wait and see what Mr. Biden does, if at all he does it differently. But my sense is that it won't be very different from Mr. Trump.
All right. Thanks, Harsh. I would like to take a question which is related more to the internal, and that's from Shreyas, related to the internal dynamics in the Democratic Party, which is we've seen the debate of, there's been that the Democrats are considered the new left, especially a section, right? The new senators, the one from New York and the one from Minnesota are considered like the new left. So how do you see these internal policies in Democrats impacting possibly its foreign policy? We've had Alexandra, the Congresswoman from New York, has given us a statement today where she sent out a letter to Biden about the policies that he would, or the cabinet that he should be looking at in the way. So how do you see that internal dynamics in the Democratic Party? Is it there a socialism aspect emerging in it, or is it a left? How does it impact its foreign policy?
Oh, very significantly, and I think for the Democrats, my sense is that this should be a bigger worry than winning this election, because if they win this election, I think there's going to be a lot of chaos internally. There are so many constituencies, there are so many disparate groups that have to be reconciled, and especially the so-called progressives now, which have emerged as in some would call extreme left, some would say left, some would say which is slightly more to the left than the traditional centrist Democratic establishment. And Bernie Sanders group, for example, and you have there is something to be said about that group, because that has energized the Democrats. But it is not entirely clear what electoral validity that group has, because at the end of the day, the Democrats throughout the country also realized that Bernie Sanders cannot win them an election. So therefore, they had to go back to a traditional Democrat like Mr. Biden. So in a sense, the question for Democrats is, do they want to be a governing party which governs from the center, or do they want to give in to the to the so-called progressives, which are more of a which is more of a social activist group? It's not the group that is bringing in all these arguments. They have won in areas which have always gone for Democrats. They come from areas where democratic establishment is well ensconced. So in a sense, that is not giving Democrats any greater electoral hedge. So I think what is going to be very significant is how these contradictions are resolved, because you have centrist Democrats like Mr. Biden who would want to have a certain kind of a foreign policy, which is a foreign policy grounded in realism, a foreign policy that takes into account some of these matters, and a foreign policy that is more pragmatic, and that has evolved under Obama. Remember, Obama also was relatively led to the left when he came to office, but very soon he realized that that's not the governing position. You have to govern from the center, and on foreign policy in particular, his views changed dramatically. I mean, even on India, and he was talking of all kinds of things when he came to office. In his campaign, he was talking that the resolution of Afghanistan lies through Kashmir, and he was talking of India's human rights records, etc. So I think for Mr. Biden, the challenge would be, how do you reconcile these Democrats to the centrist agenda? And given whatever we have seen, there are the reconciliation is not something that the progressives want. They want their agenda to be reflected, because they would think that it is their dynamism and enthusiasm that has given Mr. Biden his victory. So clearly that is going to be very, very contentious. And one of the aspects which I think is going to become more formidable, and which can become more formidable, is this challenge of the issue of environment and human rights and labor laws that might start dominating the agenda for Democrats in ways that they have not done in the last 2 decades almost. So the issue, I think, for me is sitting in India is if we just look at Mr. Biden, I don't think there is anything to worry about. But if you look at the larger flux in the Democratic Party, there can be potential challenges in how you diplomatically navigate this minefield, and a lot would depend on, again, who become the cabinet members, because that would be one reflection of how this battle is being fought. Now, in one sense, Mr. Biden has also indicated that he may not be contesting a re-election, which is again a sign, which is not a very good sign, by the way, for a leader to do, because that creates these intern-assigned rivalries in the very first place, which will hamper his first administration as well. If all the stakeholders are aiming for the next term, then there is nothing to do in the first term but to fight for second term. So I think, I would think that was a very bad move by Mr. Biden to say that openly. But now that he has said that, he can't go back. And also, we know very little about Kamala Harris's arguments, Kamala Harris's foreign policy record, Kamala Harris's priorities. It's very patchy. So again, how do you reconcile these various groups, and how do you make a case to the nation that that Democratic Party will continue to stick to the centrist line? I see challenges, but my as a student of international relations, I'm a fan of structural factors. So I think the structural reality in Indo-Pacific is such that if China is working the way it is working, you can be progressive all you want in America. You can't work like that, when it comes to Indo-Pacific. So I think a lot of that, a lot of what is happening in Indo-Pacific, a lot of what is happening with China will have a feedback loop, because remember, bureaucracies also matter. It's not simply that some administration is going to come and is going to change the argument between progressives and the centrists in the Democratic Party is going to be the defining feature. The bureaucracies have their own way of managing such challenges, and American bureaucracy is an old powerhouse. So they will have their own views about it, and they are not going to shift as easily. They've just shifted quite dramatically under Trump by taking on China. So I don't think that shift is going to be that easy to once again go back to a relatively relaxed phase. So I think a lot of these questions we will find out by January, February what is likely to happen, and then Shreyas can write his piece for Delhi Policy Group, and we can all enjoy it.
Perfect. Thanks, Harsh. I think because China has been the overarching topic in your discussion and the question also, I see. Uh, why do you think, has there been a rise of China? Is it because you spoke about Bill Clinton and during his, so how has the US administration's policies, uh, uh, say, facilitated to what extent the rise of China? And a lot of it could be internal also. And another thing would be why is China's that aggression towards the Indo-Pacific and the lack of acknowledgement, what you spoke about Indo-Pacific present?
Sorry, thank you. Pallavi, very big questions. I will try. I think, if you think about the rise of China, and there is a big argument around facilitation. Now, one way of looking at it is the way, for example, someone like John Mearsheimer looks at it, right? That it is America that created the foundation for China's rise in some ways by opening itself or by opening the global landscape for China without demanding much in return. I think for Mearsheimer, the question is not so much reciprocity, but the structural factor as to how America handled it. That if you were looking at China, if you were looking at the trend lines, then instead of opening up China in this unrealistic hope that China would become like America and China would become a political, a liberal democracy, rather than that, a more realistic framework which also demanded more from China would have been more helpful. Now, I think China plays a very, China has played a very interesting role in that sense in American foreign policy thinking, because it was China that in some ways, in more ways than one, allowed America to win the Cold War. Now, Cold War was not won in 1990. Cold War was won in 1972 when China moved from Soviet Union to the American camp. So in a sense, there has always been this obligation in certain sections of the American strategic community that you owe it to China to bring it into the global fold. So gradually that integration has happened, and if you read the writings of Henry Kissinger, who is very sharp, one of the finest minds who understood balance of power so well, and yet when it comes to China, he can get all soppy and all nostalgic and all as if you are watching a nice saccharine-loaded Bollywood movie, because he used to talk about China as if China is not a country that will have the same ambitions. It would not rise like other powers would do. But his reading of China was quite distinct from, say, a traditional balance of power understanding of China would lead you to. So there was this very interesting void in the system that you were looking at. You were trying to facilitate China's rise, but facilitating China's rise, which was clearly based on conditions which were not reciprocal. So you would give, so the idea was that let's bring China into the fold, let's make a way for China in WTO, but let's also allow China to keep those, benefits that come with being a closed economy. So let's also not push China into opening up its markets for others, but let our markets be open for China. And I think that led to this crisis, which Mr. Trump clearly exploited when he finalized his vision of how to manage China. But there is something to be said about that lack of reciprocity and how that was managed. So, I would think that while one, as a scholar, one can look at it in hindsight and say, this was a mistake. But when you are in the policy making business, policy making often is about contending options and limited and within a constrained framework. So when let's talk about Clinton administration trying to decide between its liberal hawks and its realists what to do. Clearly, the argument was that, look, China at the moment is not really a threat. China can be changed. There is a possibility of change, and we can engage with China. I mean, why blame the Americans? Every other country also did the same thing. India also continued to believe that we will be able to manage China well. We will be able to continue to have these negotiations with China on the border, even as we continue to trade with them. Japan also believed the same. Australians also believed the same. Let's keep trading, and let's that would make us more of normal partners. So I think that idea that that the liberal elements of trade and institutions, norms, and values would somehow change the Chinese behavior was a very well entrenched fact across nations, and America also led in a sense in defining those trajectories. So I would say that there has been a lot that perhaps America has learned and unlearned in its dealings with China, but to call China's rise primarily a function of America's facilitation would also not be recognizing what China has been able to accomplish. So yes, China used all the opportunities that were given to China very well. But China has also shown the world its ability to mobilize its national resources in the service of what the Communist Party believes to be its national interest. So so there is a domestic element to its rise, and there's a global context to its rise, and both are equally evident.
Thanks, Harsh. Harsh, can we go 5 minutes over? Would that be okay?
Sure.
Just 5 minutes. We have a few questions. I think I'll shift the geographical focus from China towards the transatlantic alliances and UK. So, what do you see? This is a question from Tanishq. What can be the geopolitical implications of the US elections on the transatlantic alliances with the NATO and other European powers, and possibly the future of multilateral organizations also?
Yeah, thank you. Well, transatlantic alliance, has been fraying now for quite a while, and this has been a theme. Sometimes there is a bit of selectivity in the way at times the media approaches this question in particular. So you would see that a lot of lamentation about the transatlantic relationship happened during H.W. Bush's term and then now Trump's term. But if you look at the trajectory, the transatlantic alliance ever since Cold War has been going down, because there is nothing to bind the alliance together in terms of the bigger threat perceptions. And there was a famous book that was written, the Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus. And the idea that somehow the trajectories of the two are so widely divided that it is going to lead them far in history. So unless there is a bigger threat that brings them together, the two were on different trajectories. Now then, you had this experience of fighting, for example, terrorism, or fighting China together. That might bring them together, but I think increasingly the thread that bound them together during the Cold War no longer exists, and so you have had this fraying. And there is also very interesting, development, which is that that if you look at American political leadership in Congress or in senators in the Senate, fewer and fewer of them have had any engagement with Europe. In the past, a lot of them were going to Europe to study, were engaged more with their European partners, but fewer and fewer of that is happening. Increasingly, the younger generation is more diverse. For example, first, they are more from backgrounds which are Asian Americans, Hispanics. They are also looking at, if you want to build a career today as a senator, you don't travel to France and Germany every other day. You travel to Asia Pacific. You travel to Indo-Pacific. So in a sense, that shift is also happening. Gradually, your emphasis is changing because individuals have different experiences which they are bringing to the table, both in terms of bureaucracy and in terms of legislation. So I think a number of factors are making it very clear that the transatlantic relationship is fraying. Transatlantic relationship will continue. I mean, they will never completely decouple. But there is going to be a lot of angst vis-a-vis each other. Americans would feel that they are not doing enough, that the Europeans are not doing enough to put their full share into the big mix. NATO, for example, is largely, Americans continue to complain about how Europeans are shortchanging them. Europeans would continue to complain that Americans are bullying them. So that contestation between the two would continue. They would never decouple, but they would also not, go back to that position where during the Cold War, the alliance seemed more holistic. The alliance seemed more, straightforward and capable of delivering results. Today, European Union itself is fraying. So unless European nations, European Union as an entity decides what its role is going to be in the world, I think there is very little America can do. For a long time, as America started pivoting to Asia Pacific, Europeans were not bothered. For them, it took them a long time, almost a decade. They are almost a decade behind. They've just articulated a policy on Indo-Pacific. So they are almost a decade behind. They're trying to catch up. But for them, geopolitics is not something that is a priority. For America, of course, geopolitics is a priority because America is the most important actor. And related to that is the question of multilateralism, which I think if you look around the world, multilateralism is fraying and multilateral institutions are coming under stress. As I was discussing, WHO, UN Security Council, G20, none of them could work during the coronavirus. You also have the situation of WTO being at a very critical stage. So there is a crisis of confidence, as our Prime Minister put it, in the larger UN system and a larger multilateral system. The issue is very simple, that you have the pressure from both sides. You have pressure from those emerging powers like China, who are trying to game the system. So, China gets elected to UN Human Rights Council. What is the point? What is the purpose of Human Rights Council? If a country like China and Pakistan and Cuba are part of Human Rights Council, then you might as well disband it. But they are there. They are trying to play the game. They are trying to put themselves there. Their Chinese individuals are in leadership positions in so many institutions of the UN that it's bewildering. Because the West is losing interest, because the other powers are losing interest. Americans are realizing that the Americans are withdrawing from one after another. Even HRC Americans withdrew. They're not interested. They are saying that if this is the way UN is to function, that we may not as well be part of it. Now, and so what the result is that the larger multilateral framework is at its weakest. What will be the consequences? My sense is, again, you will see fragmentation of multilateralism, fragmentation of institutions. You do not have any institutional architecture in the Indo-Pacific. So what are you relying on? You're relying on Quad, you're relying on multiplicity of trilaterals, bilaterals. So a lot of these geometries that are emerging in the region. And these are informal, these are ad hoc, these are issue-based coalitions. So multilateralism is taking a different form, where countries are more comfortable with certain kinds of institutional frameworks, like India, are more comfortable with them. They don't want a hidebound multilateral structure that puts a lot of obligations on you, but also does not work, does not deliver. So I think this transformation is going to be the new normal for us, unfortunately or fortunately. And we will see the consequences as they evolve over the next few years. Let's hope for the best.
Yeah. Harsh, the last question, and I think this is a good question for the last one, is the role of social media and tech companies that they play globally. Because we've seen a lot of these tech companies be part of the foreign policies or somehow be somewhere as a player in these foreign policies. So how do you see these companies playing a role, especially because most of them are American tech companies? So how do you see them going forward, playing a role in the foreign policies of US and globally, actually?
Yeah, I mean, it's, technology and, of course, media is, has always played a role in some sense. There is a reason why there used to be this debate, even in India, that, you have organizations like CNN or BBC or New York Times, how biased they are. Do they understand India? Are they putting a certain gloss over a certain, over certain issues? that represented in some ways the power of American media, the power of American tech, and some of these big giants as they evolved. What is interesting is that the pushback that is coming from countries like China and Russia now. So they are using technology as an asymmetric means of targeting the West and targeting other countries. So which is, I think, which puts a different angle on this question. Because if you see that the kind of disinformation campaign that are used by some countries today, I mean, the whole debate on Trump's victory and what role Russia played, and the role of China, for example, in countries like Australia, in the political structures. This is this is very, very interesting, and it's only going to go become even more significant because, again, there is very little that Western liberal democracies can do in China or in Russia. There's a firewall in China. You can't really penetrate that. Whereas they have the luxury of using the open spaces that are provided by liberal uneven this bargain that is there between these two types of countries, these two types of groups, is going to be one of the more interesting contestations, I think, going forward, because technology development is itself getting fragmented. As I was saying, if the argument is that like-minded countries should generate emerging technologies together, if the argument is that conceptually, if you go back, the argument was, if you trade more, if you are engaged with the other country more, for example, if you are into high-end technological cooperation with other countries more, you develop political trust. Now that has been turned on its head. Now the argument is you only work with those countries with whom you have political trust. So India is making it very clear that it would, by some of the decisions India has taken in the last few months, that China is going to be out of certain sectors, of certain critical sectors. America has made it very clear. Europeans are making that very clear. Australians are making that very clear. If that is the case, then you end up in a situation where certain like-minded countries will work together and develop technologies. They will trade more. They will engage with each other more. And that is going to lead to a different set of outcomes. On the other hand, you will have other set of countries that will likely to present an alternative. So that technology contestation is going to be one of the defining contestations, because that would lead to the fourth industrial, that is going to be the basis of a fourth industrial revolution. And you have the role of social media that get ensconced in this larger debate, because social media has to respond to this challenge. Now, as countries become more aware of the challenge that they are facing, there is going to be enormous pressure on social media. You already see that, how the right wing complains, the left wing complains, what kind of messages being sent, what kind of messages are being prioritized, what kind of algorithms are being written, who is writing those algorithms, what are the priorities, what are the preferences. And I think all those questions become the dominant points of conversations as you go forward, especially as there is no global conversation happening on these issues. At one point, the argument was that everyone would come together and have a global consensus on what kind of a architecture you want for managing these trends. I don't think that is likely to happen. If that is not happening, then either countries would go their individual ways, or they will coalesce with other countries, with other like-minded countries, to mobilize their resources and to manage this transition.
Great, Harsh. Thank you so much for that, winding up everything together. But thank you for joining us today. And I think you did give us a very good overview of how these US elections have impacted the global geopolitics. So thank you for kicking us off for the US presidential election series. And thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you next week with Ambassador Meera Shankar, and have a good weekend.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you, Professor.
Bye. Take care, everyone.